Hey everybody, it's Jack Reed here. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of the conference this year and to be one of your keynote speakers. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen. Also, apologies that I'm not there with you in person. Unfortunately, events conspired against us somewhat, and so I'm here in the southwest of England, and 3,000 miles away from where you are just now. It's late August here, and it's been a really hot, very dry summer, and I've just popped down from where I live to one of my favourite local nature reserves. I'm here in a place called Leafland, which is owned by one of the wildlife trusts here. And just behind me, you can't really see it, but just behind me is the River Exe. It's very, very low, there's not much going on, but there are a few ducks paddling around the place, a few pigeons of course, and if you keep your eye out you might even see a kingfisher darting up the river. Now a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you so much to both Liz and Kyle for the invitation to come along and speak, and when I saw the conference theme I thought, well, there's certainly quite a lot that I could probably speak to about that really, especially my research on young people, digital technologies and outdoor education. And so when I was thinking about what I wanted my keynote to be, I thought, well, why can't it be a little bit of a look to the future, a think about what might happen over the next 5 years with outdoor education, but also to think a little bit about where we are right now in relation to mobile technologies, social media, to kind of hopefully give you a bit of a snapshot of, where we are at the moment and perhaps some of the themes that are going to begin dictating outdoor learning as we move through the next 5 years. So, a little bit about me. So, I'm here in the southwest of England. I'm a research fellow at the University of Exeter, and I completed my PhD up at the University of Edinburgh in education, and I also have a master's degree from the University of Edinburgh in outdoor education. Before all of that, I was a professional cyclist and still am a very keen cyclist. At the age of 15, I was the youngest professional cyclist in the UK. I was taught at home by my parents and very much was a full-time athlete. These days, thankfully, the pace is much slower and I enjoy mountain biking. I have a gravel bike and actually in a few days' time, heading down to the Alps to do some cycling down there, which is going to be very exciting. In terms of my PhD, I started that back in 2020, and I was very interested in how social media spaces affect how young people connect to nature, and partnered with the Outward Bound Trust, which is one of the large outdoor education providers here in the UK, to begin asking young people, well, how do spaces like TikTok and Instagram and Minecraft affect how you connect to the natural environment? And actually what I found was quite rich and at times quite scary, and in this presentation I'll certainly talk a little bit about all of that. And these days I'm really involved in policy, so I'm very interested also in nature recovery, which is a very big component in British policy at the moment, and so thinking a little bit about how nature recovery affects rural areas. So that's a little bit about me. I also wanted to show some photos of my cat, because who doesn't love cats? This is Pickle. Pickle is our rescue cat. He is delightful, and he's a little indoor cat, so can't be here, unfortunately. But wanted to quickly show a few photos. In terms of the aim of this session, I was hoping that really it would be an opportunity to rethink and reimagine what outdoor education might look like in 2030. And to do that, like I mentioned, I'll start with the kind of current literature, think a little bit about the future, and then hopefully present a kind of hopeful indication of what outdoor education will look like in 5 years' time. Before we get there, I thought it might be wise to go and ask artificial intelligence what it might think outdoor education would look like in 2030. So I went into various different AI pieces of software and asked the question, what do you think outdoor education will look like in 2030? And this is what it came up with. So there are 3 videos that I'll show just now. So take a look through. There's a bit of audio in them as well. Very short, sort of 5 to 10 seconds long each one. And I'll see you in just a second.
Good job, almost there.
Watch your footing on that next hold.
This week, I really pushed my limits.
Seeing our journey mapped out like that, it's amazing.
The AI helped me articulate things I couldn't before.
Okay, team, the AI says the safest path is just ahead. Watch your step near the stream.
Okay, so now that you've seen those videos, I'm very interested in what you think of them. I've got my own viewpoint. I think that it's a bit of a sad narrative in some way. It very much is about these kind of technologies augmenting young people's experiences. And I guess also the kind of rock climbing example is kind of quite interesting, because it's kind of demonstrating the instructor as being AI in some way, and the kind of artificial intelligence beginning to demonstrate how it can act as a learning agent, which I think is really alarming. So that's an interesting perspective to think about as we move forward. There's also something quite interesting, I think, in the fireside activity, which is a group of young people, I assume, sitting down and reflecting about their experience and how digital technologies can help enhance those kind of reflective practices. But again, it's that kind of dystopian kind of approach in some way, I think, because do we really want young people to be rethinking their outdoor learning experiences through this technological prism? But of course, these are young people's realities, that young people are situated in these technologies, and so perhaps it does offer opportunity to enhance learning. More on that in a second. And then the final video, I guess, with the hiking, sort of seeing AI and technology here beginning to influence how young people move through a space, and kind of highlighting some of the risks and some of the direction that they should be travelling. And I think what this begins to recognise is that outdoor education is very much entangled with technology, because of course it would have been using GPS, which was using satellites 20 miles above our heads, which would then begin to filter into those spaces. So even though we go out into nature and think there's no technology here, actually technology is really, really close, even if we cannot see it. So we'll leave that there, and now let's take a little look at the current state of the literature in outdoor education in relation to technology. Okay, with that initial sort of thought process out the way, let's take a little look at outdoor education literature and research in 2025 in relation to digital technologies. Now, I guess I've contributed quite a lot to some of those things, which is quite nice, and I'm very privileged to have done that. And what I wanted to draw your attention to was a special issue that myself and a couple of collaborators, Dave Hills in Australia and Imre van Kralingen in Norway, put together a couple of years ago in the Journal of Adventure Education and Outdoor Learning. Now, all three of us were PhD candidates at the time, and all three of us were very interested in digital technologies, and that was the kind of centrepiece of our PhD research. And so, as a three, we kind of came together and thought, well, what can we do? What can we offer back to the community that begins to open up some of these conversations? And so we secured this special issue with JAEOL, and it raised a few very, very important and key themes. Two kind of themes initially emerged. First of all, the influence of technology, so hardware, on outdoor education, so the things that we can see and touch, like our mobile phones. But then also something else emerged, and that was the role of networked environments. So these are the things that perhaps we can't see and that we don't necessarily know are present. So things like social media spaces, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and how those kinds of networked environments begin to come into the outdoor learning environment and affect the quality and nature of young people's experiences. There was also a set of themes around the limitations of digital technologies. Now, really, I guess we know a lot about the limitations of digital tech in this space. And really the first is this narrative of distraction, that technologies will distract young people from the outdoor learning environment. And I think that's really important and really, really topical as we move through these discussions. There's also a lot here on the kind of Western domination of research, and very much a kind of lack of global South and Indigenous perspectives on technologies. And I'm absolutely part of the kind of Western dominance in this space. And so I'm very reflective about that. And very interested and keen to learn from others whose experiences and cultures are different to our own. And I think the special issue began to kind of uncover some of these discussions and offers a bit of a foreground really for anybody interested in taking that further, as it's really, really important. There's also something here on philosophy. So I think that there's part of the outdoor education philosophy is that sometimes we go out into these natural environments to escape the fast-paced nature of society and to escape technology, to escape social media. And so really there's this underpinning philosophical perspective that begins to inform how instructors approach the use of technology or not in their practice. And again, that came out in the special issue. What also came out was the importance of young people's voices in all of these things. And I think it's so important because really most of outdoor learning research has focused on adult perspectives, the perspectives of you or I really. And I think we've neglected the voice of young people in those discussions. And so if we are going to take away a young person's technology, what are they going to think about that? What's their perspective? And in my PhD research, and I'll come on to that in a second, that really is the approach that I took was, well, I have my own viewpoint, my own perspective, but what do these young people in this setting think about their technologies being taken away from them? And also, how does social media affect how they come to understand and connect to the natural world? So really, I think it needs to start with young people in this space. What do young people need? How can we support them? And how does outdoor education offer richness to their lives? I think that came out of the special issue quite strongly too. And then really there's this kind of idea of ethics. Is it the right thing to do, taking a young person's technology away from them? Is it the right thing to do, encouraging them to use their technologies? And I think this comes back to that kind of philosophy in some way. And I guess there's no right answer, really. It very much will be down to the individual instructor or educator. But again, I caution that by saying we also need to be relating back to young people at all times. And I guess all of this kind of relates back to a very early paper that was published 21 years ago by Cuthbertson, Socher and Potter, again in the Journal of Adventure Education and Outdoor Learning. And what they wrote about was something called the double-edged sword in relation to technology. So they put forward this kind of for and against argument where technology is viewed first of all as an enhancer of outdoor education, but then second of all as an inhibitor of outdoor education. And I think if I could point you in the direction of any literature today, have a little read of this paper. I think it's the one that really does encapsulate the current state of outdoor education in relation to technology, even if it was published over 2 decades ago. I think that still there is this tendency to dichotomize technology. There's this tendency to say it could be great or it could be terrible, and that there is almost no middle ground. And really it's that middle ground that I as a researcher and as a practitioner am really interested in. And that's what's really guided my kind of theoretical developments that I've put forward, but also my empirical research too. So I want to talk a little bit about that middle ground. What happens when we begin to think of technology not as for and against, but as somewhere in the middle. So let's have a little look at that. And just before we look at that, I'd like you to place yourself on this continuum. So this is just a continuum that I've just thrown together recently. Where would you place yourself on this for and against argument? Would you say that technology fundamentally has no place in outdoor education and place yourself way over on the left-hand side? Or would you place yourself on the right-hand side and say that technology has every place in outdoor education? Or are you somewhere in the middle? And when we meet online in a few weeks' time, I'd love to chat with you a little bit about that. Where do you position yourself? I'd be fascinated to hear. Okay, so let's now begin thinking about technology as no longer being this kind of for and against argument. And this kind of gets into some of my own research and thoughts, really. So I think there have been attempts, and especially in the last couple of years, to really challenge the simplicity of this for and against argument. And that comes from an increasing recognition that digital technologies and these kind of networked spaces are always available, always there, and increasingly characterize society. And we can see that way beyond the outdoor education space. I mean, even this space is now related to technology. What you can't see is that I've got a laptop over here with my notes that I keep glancing at. You've probably noticed that. I've got a camera, I've got my little audio device, and so this entire presentation is in some way sustained by digital technologies. And later on I'll go and edit it, and then I'll upload it to YouTube, and then it will be sent 3,000 miles across the Atlantic and be delivered to you. And so even here we can see how technology sustains our realities in some way. But also kind of more generally in society, if you think about the way that we manage our finances, mostly online. I can't remember the last time I saw any cash, physical cash, really. I think the way that we socialise is increasingly online, especially when we think about contemporary youth culture and how young people socialise. We know that a lot of that socialisation is done in online spaces. And so this begins to offer a bit of a problem for outdoor learning and this kind of simplicity of the for and against argument, where we have to begin recognising that young people are part of these digital societies and think a little bit about, well, how does that influence the learning outcomes that need to be achieved as part of outdoor education, and how do we as instructors begin to help facilitate those outcomes? So back in 2021, about 12 months into my PhD, I approached Kyle at Pathways and said, I've got an idea. And that idea was grounded in a theory called postdigital theory. Now, postdigital theory is very new, although the term first appeared in the year 2000 and then kind of disappeared for a while. And then in 2018, kind of exploded back onto the scene in some way. And there's now a journal called the Journal of Postdigital Science and Education. And as I was beginning to read the literature around outdoor learning and technology, and then kind of going off more broadly and looking at technology and society, I came across this term, postdigital, and have been kind of fascinated with it ever since. And it really does underpin my philosophy as an outdoor learning practitioner, but also my philosophy as an academic and as a researcher. And I thought, well, I want to try this theory out a little bit in the outdoor learning space, and I want to do that in a fairly safe environment. And so I thought that the Pathways Journal would be a really nice place to do that. And so Kyle said, absolutely, let's go for it. And I put together a paper for Pathways that I think was, well, I know was the first attempt at introducing post-digital theory into outdoor education. So what is the post-digital? Well, post-digital is in and of itself a flawed term, because it doesn't mean after digital in a kind of post-digital sense. What it means is kind of what I've been talking about already in some ways, is that technologies are more and more entangled with our daily lives, with our daily reality, and that in some ways we can no longer turn those technologies and those infrastructures off. And so that, as a sort of social science characterization, begins to really open up a few important questions. Can we ever escape from digital technology? And if we cannot, well, what does that mean for outdoor learning? And so in my PhD, what I discovered was with a group of young people, so I worked with 50 young people, all from areas of multiple deprivation across Scotland, England and Wales, and took them along to 3 outward bound residential centres, again in England, Scotland and Wales, and hung out with those young people for 5 days at each centre, so 15 days in total. And what I found for those young people was a post-digital understanding of their experience. And that was across 2 key themes, really. The first theme was that when young people's technologies were taken away from them, that led to enormous amounts of anxiety, stress and anger, especially around not being able to talk with home and talk with their parents and caregivers, which was really, really interesting. And I think at times that kind of separation from their digital technologies somewhat detracted from the outdoor learning experience. It certainly became a distraction for some young people. And I think really that is evidence of the post-digital at work. These young people are so embedded and entangled with their technologies that simply removing their mobile phone is actually a really alien and quite stigmatizing experience in some way. So that was the first kind of key theme. The second theme was in relation to how young people understood the natural world. And I'll give a couple of examples. So there was one example where I was canoeing with a young person. He was 13 years old, from Newcastle up in the northeast of England. And we were canoeing across this lake called Ullswater in the Lake District. And it's stunning, really an incredible place with high mountains above us, a perfectly flat, calm lake. And as we were going along, the young person looked across and under his breath said, "I can't believe what I'm seeing. I can't believe that this place exists." And I followed up with him and said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I know this place from Minecraft. I know that this is an oak tree. I know what I can use this water for, but I didn't know that this place actually looked like this. And so again, it was this kind of post-digital entanglement with that canoeing experience. This young person understood the natural environment. He understood and was able to label all the different components of nature and how that would potentially sustain human life. But he had never experienced that in person. And that to me is the power of outdoor learning. And that was quite a profound moment actually, and still sticks with me to this day. The other example is that we were just walking up to doing a rock climbing activity. And we had this, oh, hello, there's a dog just come and join me. Hello there. I know. Thanks. The other example, yes, was from this rock climbing activity. So the young people were walking up towards the crag. I was just standing at the back, and there was these high ferns kind of in and amongst us, and the young people just disappeared into the ferns and began ripping up the ferns at quite a speed actually, and came back out, and they were pressing the ferns against their skin. So I had young people pressing them against their forearm, pressing them against their forehead for sort of 2 or 3 minutes, and it was leaving a bit of an imprint of the fern on their skin. So I found this kind of fascinating, also did it myself, which was quite good fun, and asked the young people, well, what on earth is this all about? And they said, oh, this is from TikTok. This is nature tattooing. And so I went away and had a little look at TikTok, and as it turns out, it was a really big trend a few years ago where you could go out into nature, select a leaf or some kind of other natural object, press it against your skin, and it would leave this impression. And so for the young people, it all of a sudden no longer was about the rock climbing activity. It was about being able to replicate something that they had seen in the TikTok environment. And so again, to me, this was evidence of the post-digital in some way. It began to kind of recognise that these physical spaces where we take young people are no longer just physical and detached from the digital space. For young people, those digital spaces offer a kind of a lens, I suppose, through which they could then begin to understand what they were seeing. And for those young people that I was working with, that was nature tattooing. So I think there is already a bit of evidence here around the kind of post-digital, and absolutely delighted that the Pathways magazine was the first space where the post-digital featured in the outdoor learning context. And so just did a little bit of a summary here around outdoor education in 2025 in relation to technology. So I think there is a need to turn towards young people's perspectives, and that's certainly what I learned in my PhD, was, well, if these young people are relating to these natural environments through Minecraft or through TikTok, how can we use those spaces and those experiences from those young people to enhance learning and enhance those learning outcomes that we all seek to achieve in outdoor education? I think that's really important. There's also a bit of a development in relation to a rights-based approach. So this is linked to the United Nations and is off the back of a paper that I published at the start of last year. So there's an increasing tendency in education more broadly to ban mobile phones. And that's often based on narratives to do with distractions, cyberbullying, so on and so forth. However, the United Nations published in 2021 the Digital Rights of the Child, and it holds really interesting reading, because what it says is that you cannot take away a child's technologies or access to the internet without reason to do so. And so I'm very interested in this. What does reason to do so mean in this space? In a legal sense, is taking a young person's technology away from them in outdoor learning a reason to do so? I guess in terms of safety, absolutely, it's a reason to do so. But in other places, does that still hold true? And I think as we proceed over the next 5 years, this might be something that begins to become a little bit more important in education spaces is, well, are we actually taking young people's technologies away for the correct reasons? And if not, in what ways might that relate to the rights of the child in relation to the United Nations? So that's just something for us to think about. Of course, there is also a climate and biodiversity crisis. I'm seeing that this year here in the southwest of England. And what you might be able to see, I'm not sure if you can see it on the screen, but also here is an invasive plant, Himalayan balsam, which is really prevalent here in the southwest of England this year. It shouldn't be here. It should be in the Himalayas, but our shifting climate means that actually it does grow here pretty well now. It's also been a really dry year, really hot. Some of the leaves behind the camera here are already beginning to change in August, which is very unusual. So I think you cannot think of outdoor education without thinking about the climate and biodiversity crisis, and we know unfortunately that that's only going to get worse over the coming years. But delighted to say, and I'm going to talk more about the kind of UK context here, but I'm sure it's the same with yourselves in Canada, is that there's an increasing recognition on the importance of outdoor education for young people. We know that young people are disconnected from nature, fundamentally, and that outdoor learning can provide those opportunities to reconnect with the natural world, but also to offer learning in context. To this day, I cannot think of a single piece of the curriculum that cannot be delivered outside. And what better than taking a geography class or a history class out into the context that you are learning about? To me, there is nothing better or more powerful for a young person. And in the UK, in Westminster just at the moment, there's some work being undertaken to introduce an outdoor education bill, which is aiming to ensure that every young person in secondary education, so 11 to 16, will have access to a residential outdoor learning programme during their time in secondary school. And so I think that this is an exciting time, and my hope is that by 2030 there's going to be lots and lots of positive moves towards recognising that outdoor learning should be at the heart of the curriculum and not at the periphery of the curriculum. So that's where we are, but let's now take a little look at outdoor education in 2030 and some of the thoughts that I have around what the future of outdoor learning might look like. Okay, so now that we've looked at where outdoor education is at the moment in relation to the current literature, let's think a little bit about what outdoor education might look like in 2030. So to do that, I've prepared a few scenarios for us to consider. And here's the first one. So the first one is that technologies continue full pace into the outdoor education space. And really, I can absolutely see this being quite a feasible scenario in many ways, because technologies, certainly over the last 5 years, sort of pre-COVID and then sort of into the post-COVID era, I think we are beginning to really see technology featuring in outdoor learning more and more readily. And so who's to say that's going to stop over the next 5 years? And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, what sorts of technology are likely to feature in this space? And I think really there's three dominant areas that I would expect to see either continuing or building over the next 5 years. The first is artificial intelligence. So we know that AI has exploded over the last couple of years. We also know that AI has begun to feature in education more broadly, kind of beyond the outdoor learning space, especially when it comes to things like marking, when it comes to things like assessments, those kinds of areas. But I think really there's a bit of a challenge here for AI in some ways, or at least a challenge for outdoor education, because what we know from spaces like ChatGPT is all that it does is scrape information from the internet. So if I was to go onto ChatGPT later, ask it a question, it will then use all of its different algorithms to look at all the data that it has from the internet and just represent that to me. And what this does really is kind of homogenize knowledge. And I think learning is much more than just a transaction. Learning is way more embodied and situated than that. And so what might happen to our learners in the next 5 years is this kind of understanding around, or maybe a misunderstanding around what knowledge actually is. And I think outdoor education is really well placed to challenge some of those assumptions. So yeah, a bit of a limitation, but also possibly an opportunity there. Of course, I think social media is going to continue to be a real feature, and of course that links to young people's mobile technologies. And I have no doubt that social media will continue to be a real influence in young people's lives in the next 5 years. But what we have seen is that politics can also influence access to technologies, and specifically to social media. So, for instance, the US banning TikTok and then deciding not to ban TikTok is one example of that. But also, as I was talking about a little bit earlier, having social media banned for young people. So there's a kind of political component to that too, and I think that does generate opportunity for change, but I really cannot see social media disappearing altogether in the next 5 years. And then finally, I think the other kind of area for us to consider is wearable technologies and how wearable technologies will begin to feature in outdoor education. I mean, I even have a piece of wearable technology with me right now with this small microphone. So even here in 2025, these things are absolutely possible. What I think could change over the next 5 years is the relationship between wearable technology and how we monitor our own health. And I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility where we might have a young person coming along to our programs who needs to use a piece of wearable technology to manage something like diabetes, for example, so looking at their blood sugar levels. And this is already beginning to kind of feature a little bit. I mean, I've not seen it in outdoor education, and I'd be interested to know whether any of you have. But in conversation with a few collaborators, we were sort of thinking, well, imagine this situation in outdoor education where you're going off and doing some kind of water-based activity, and a young person has on them a piece of wearable technology that manages and monitors their blood sugar levels. And that piece of technology speaks to their mobile phone through Bluetooth, and then that mobile phone also speaks to a parent or caregiver's mobile phone through mobile signal, and it provides updates and alerts when the health issue is potentially emerging. So what happens in outdoor learning when a young person presents with those sorts of technologies? That's going to be a real question for us to consider, I think, especially when it comes to things like water-based activities, rock climbing activities, activities where the technology might be damaged. How do we as educators facilitate including those young people whilst also ensuring that their technologies aren't damaged? That's a real question, and I think really gets us beyond that kind of for and against argument that I was describing earlier too. So that is future scenario 1. Future scenario 2 is different altogether. So future scenario 2 basically says that young people will come to outdoor learning spaces wanting to disconnect. And I think that there's something in this. As I was putting this together, I was thinking, wouldn't it be quite a nice scenario where young people in 5 years' time who are part of this hyper-connected technological society facilitated by artificial intelligence, when they come to an outdoor learning space, being able to say, do you know what, for the next few days or few weeks, I want to put down my technologies and experience life in a more kind of disconnected sense. And I think that very much is a possibility. Certainly one of the case studies that I worked on during my PhD, there were hints of that. And what I noticed was that the instructor did a really nice job of positioning purposeful disconnection as part of the challenge of the adventurous learning program. So what we did was we went away on an expedition overnight, and the instructor's preference was that young people wouldn't take their technologies with them for distraction and various other purposes. And what he did was position that as part of the experience of being out in the bush, out in the field. Why don't we, as a group, agree, all 13 of us or 14 of us, we're going to put our phones down, we're going to leave them at the centre, and part of the challenge of this expedition is to experience disconnection. Now, for those young people, they bought into that, and it was really exciting, although one young person did bring along their phone hidden in a sock at the bottom of their bag, so it's not always black and white. But what it did facilitate was an extra component to the outdoor learning programme, young people kind of buying into that, and I think opened up extra learning opportunities, which is really, really important. So maybe we'll begin to see some of this too. Yes, technology being a huge part of society, but young people wanting to disconnect in some way. And really that gets us into this scenario, so scenario 3, which is thinking about maybe something in the middle, we know that technology is likely to increase and it's likely to begin influencing outdoor education more and more, certainly in terms of those kind of networked baselines that I was talking about and how technologies can influence how young people interpret the world around them. I think that's certainly going to become more and more of an issue and way more prevalent. But maybe also young people are going to want to disconnect. And so maybe there's something in the middle here that will begin to unfold where, yes, there's all of this connectivity, but there are opportunities to disconnect, and outdoor education is a fantastic space to achieve that. So I think that could be quite a nice scenario. There's one final scenario, and that is this one. So it's a hopeful scenario. And it takes the three scenarios that have happened already, that I've just described, and adds an extra dimension. And that is that by 2030, outdoor education will be valued more than it is in 2025. And as I mentioned earlier, certainly in the UK, there's a bit of a push to recognise the importance of outdoor learning in policy. So like I mentioned in Westminster, for example. And so who's to say that in 5 years' time, outdoor education is no longer part of the periphery of any given curriculum, but is actually at the centre of the curriculum? To me, that really is the hopeful narrative that I hope we can all take away from the conference is, yes, these technologies are here. Yes, they can be influential in both a positive and negative and very complex sense. However, there's also this kind of policy space that means that outdoor learning is going to be recognised as more and more important. And I think that is quite hopeful, isn't it? At least I think it is. So that's quite nice. So let's get into a bit of a wrap-up from this keynote session. So I hope what I've presented is that in the next 5 years, we can expect quite a lot of change for outdoor education, and we can definitely expect more and more technology. And if we take this kind of idea of a post-digital society where ultimately technology underpins everything that we do, then I think the role of outdoor education becomes all the more important. So I think in the next 5 years, there's going to be some real changes in that sense. I think that really there's also probably three themes that personally I'm really interested in thinking a little bit about. So the first is this kind of idea of an augmented experience. And the photograph on the slide here is an AI generated photograph, and I asked it to present a photo that might kind of encapsulate outdoor education in 5 years. And you'll see the participant on the left-hand side there wearing these kind of wearable glasses, and this idea of a kind of augmented reality where we are in our physical space but have something in front of our vision that augments different components through a kind of virtual interface. I absolutely see that being a part of outdoor learning in 5 years' time. And so as educators, I guess there's a bit of a decision to make there is, well, how do we use that for positive benefit? I've got some thoughts on that, and maybe if anybody has any questions during the Q&A session, we'll be very happy to answer those. The other thing that I'm very interested in is equity and access. What I've spoken about so far is certainly how technology is likely to become more and more prevalent in society and outdoor education, but these technologies are very, very expensive. And so what's the likelihood of a participation gap beginning to emerge in relation to young people's access to tech? I think that that's going to be a really important question to ask. There's also, of course, this question around kind of the capitalist foundations of technology and, how a very few number of people at the top are making a lot of money out of this space. And so I think as outdoor educators, we can also begin to help young people see these structures of society around us, and technology certainly gives us an opportunity to do that. And then just very finally, I think the other theme that I'm really interested in kind of keeping an eye on is how outdoor education can rewild human attention. And this kind of comes a little bit out of my PhD with those young people who fundamentally understood nature, but only understood it through a virtual space. And so what I saw was certainly a bit of a rewilding of young people's attention and young people's perceptions of the world around them. And I think given we are in a climate and biodiversity crisis, and given we are increasingly disconnected from our natural world, wouldn't it be fantastic if outdoor learning can continue to help young people understand and connect to the world around them? And that links to a piece of research by Miles Richardson that was released just a couple of weeks ago, actually, here at the University of Derby in the UK. And he found that since 1800 in the UK, nature connectedness has decreased by 60%. So in 225 years, a 60% reduction in how we connect to nature, which is endlessly fascinating and quite worrying. And so I think really that's going to be a key theme over the next 5 years as well. This kind of intermixing in some way, I suppose, of technology, young people, outdoor learning, and how that facilitates some form of connectedness to the natural environment. Okay, I hope that this has been useful. So let me just quickly go through to the next slide. Here it is. So this is just a quick thank you slide, really, and just an invitation to keep in touch. So my email address is j.read2@exeter.ac.uk. We'd love to keep in touch with anybody. If anybody has any thoughts or further questions, please feel free to reach out. And just once again, a huge thanks to the conference organisers for inviting me along. Huge apologies that I can't be there in person, but I hope that this has been interesting, insightful, and perhaps will open up a few questions for us to discuss. Thank you very much.